Anne had spent a lifetime inside a system where precedence mattered, but loyalty mattered more. She had bowed to crowns, obeyed monarchs, and protected the institution without demanding applause. Yet there was one distinction she supposedly refused to surrender. Rank could determine position, but it could not manufacture history. For Anne, hierarchy had never been meaningless. She understood better than most that monarchy survived because people accepted order, discipline, and rules larger than themselves. She had spent decades following those rules without complaint. But in her mind, there was a limit. Protocol could determine who walked first at a state occasion. It could decide where someone sat, when they entered, and how they were addressed. What it could not do, Anne believed, was command private emotion. And that was where Camilla's position became complicated. As queen, Camilla possessed a status no member of the family could simply ignore. On paper, the order was clear. Inside the family, however, paper could not erase memory. Anne carried decades of royal history with her. She remembered the family before this court, before titles shifted, before relationships were rearranged around a new reign. To Anne, continuity mattered because it protected the crown from becoming whatever the present moment demanded. Camilla saw the issue differently. Her role carried dignity, and she expected that dignity to be recognized consistently. She had endured years of scrutiny to reach this position, and being treated as though the title mattered only when convenient could feel like another form of rejection. Yet Anne drew a sharp distinction. Respecting Camilla as queen was one thing. Being expected to personally yield in every family setting was another. That difference had reportedly made tightly organized gatherings increasingly tense. Palace aides could arrange chairs, entrances, and schedules, but they could not eliminate what remained unsaid between two women who rarely sought open confrontation and yet rarely surrendered ground. Charles had seen smaller versions of the problem before. Each time, he had allowed the moment to pass, perhaps believing familiarity would eventually soften the edges. Instead, every unresolved incident left another layer beneath the surface. And Anne's position contained its own painful contradiction. She would defend Charles as sovereign without hesitation. She would protect the monarchy he represented. But loyalty to her brother did not mean accepting every expectation attached to his wife. That was why the entrance mattered. It was not simply a question of who moved first. It was the moment when years of carefully managed ambiguity finally became impossible to hide. And when Camilla finally understood that Anne was not simply distracted, the atmosphere changed completely. Because what happened next transformed a quiet disagreement over precedence into a direct test of who would back down first. For several seconds, neither woman moved. Camilla had faced hostile headlines, difficult introductions, and years of public judgment. But this was different. There were no cameras to persuade, and no statement to issue, only Anne standing between expectation and reality, refusing to make the smallest gesture of surrender. Camilla understood the danger immediately. If she simply stepped around Anne and continued forward, the meaning would become impossible to soften later. It would no longer look like confusion. It would look like a challenge answered with force. So she stopped. That pause carried more weight than any argument, because everyone nearby could sense that both women now understood exactly what was happening. A senior aide attempted to ease the tension without drawing attention to it. The plan had been simple. The order had been discussed. Everyone was supposed to move. But Anne had created a problem no staff member could easily solve because she was not shouting, refusing instructions, or openly breaking protocol. She was simply standing where she believed she had every right to stand. Camilla then tried a softer approach. With careful restraint, she asked whether everyone was ready to proceed. It was an opening, almost an escape route. Anne could have moved without appearing defeated. She could have allowed the moment to disappear. But Anne did not take it. Her reply remained controlled, almost formal, yet the message underneath was unmistakable. She intended to follow the arrangement as she understood it. No accusation, no insult. Just a refusal to rewrite the moment for Camilla's benefit. That calmness made the tension worse. For Camilla, the encounter touched a deeper insecurity. A title could establish rank. It could determine precedence. But it could not force belonging. Years of effort, survival, and adjustment had brought her to the highest level of royal life. Yet Anne's resistance exposed the painful possibility that acceptance inside the family still had limits. Catherine stayed carefully neutral. She knew that even a look, a gesture, or an attempt to help could be interpreted later as taking sides. William, however, was becoming increasingly alert. He could already see the larger danger. What looked like a personal standoff could quickly become precedent, and precedent inside the monarchy had a way of lasting far longer than the emotions that created it. Then Charles began moving toward them. The people closest to the doorway understood at once that the matter had passed beyond staff, schedules, and quiet intervention. The king was now being forced to choose how authority would respond when family loyalty and royal precedence collided in the same room. Every eye then shifted toward Charles, because only the king could end the standoff without anyone openly admitting defeat, but his first reaction was not the command either woman expected. Charles reached the doorway with the authority to settle everything in seconds. One instruction could have restored the procession and ended the embarrassment. Instead, he looked from Anne to Camilla and remained silent, and the absence of a command landed harder than any royal reprimand could have done. Charles understood the trap immediately. If he told Anne to step aside, he would protect Camilla's position, but risk humiliating his sister in front of the family. If he allowed Anne to remain where she was, the message could seem just as dangerous. That even the Queen's place could be questioned when old loyalties and private resentment entered the room. For a man who had spent years trying to balance family wounds with royal duty, there was no clean answer. So he watched. And everyone noticed. Senior relatives, courtiers, and advisors had stopped paying attention to the entrance itself. Now they were studying Charles. His reaction had become more important than Anne's refusal. Would he command? Would he defend Camilla? Would he quietly support Anne? Every second without an answer made the tension heavier. For Camilla, that hesitation cut deeply. Her position beside Charles was not separate from his authority, it depended on it. She had expected him to restore the order without discussion. Instead, she found herself waiting while the king considered whether defending her in that moment might create an even greater family fracture. Anne did nothing to make his decision easier. She could have stepped back and allowed Charles to escape the confrontation without choosing. She did not. Her stillness forced him to face the very issue he had allowed to remain unresolved for too long. Soon, even ordinary conversation faded. What had begun as a subtle disagreement over movement had become the emotional center of the gathering. Then, Charles finally spoke, but he did not tell Anne she was wrong, nor did he insist Camilla proceed exactly as planned. Instead, he asked for the entrance arrangement to be adjusted. It was a careful compromise, designed to move everyone forward without producing a visible winner or loser. The immediate embarrassment eased, but the meaning of the decision was harder to hide. Camilla understood the warning. Charles would protect her dignity, but perhaps not by publicly disciplining Anne. Anne understood something equally important. Her position had not been defeated, but Charles had not endorsed it either. The immediate crisis had been contained, but the compromise created a far more dangerous question. If Charles would not choose between his wife and his sister in the room, what would he do once the palace doors closed? The confrontation everyone expected at the doorway never happened there. It came later, away from the gathering, when Charles demanded to know why Anne had placed him in an impossible position. Her answer reportedly cut directly through protocol and revealed that the argument had never truly been about who entered first. Charles made his position clear. Whatever Anne felt privately, the hierarchy surrounding the monarch could not become something each family member interpreted differently whenever old wounds resurfaced. To him, the danger was larger than one awkward entrance. If public-facing order became negotiable, then every future ceremony could become another test of personality, loyalty, and memory. Anne pushed back immediately. She had not challenged the crown, she argued. She had challenged the idea that Camilla's rank should automatically settle every private family interaction. There was a difference, and Anne believed Charles had allowed that difference to blur for too long. That was where the disagreement became deeper than protocol. Charles saw loyalty as protecting the structure around the sovereign, even when that structure demanded personal restraint. Anne saw loyalty differently. To her, loyalty sometimes meant telling the monarch when symbolism was being pushed too far, before resentment hardened into something impossible to control. She reminded Charles that she had spent decades serving, without asking the institution to reorganize itself around her feelings. Duty had often demanded sacrifice, silence, and discomfort. She had accepted all three. What she would not accept, however, was the suggestion that respect required emotional surrender. That argument frustrated Charles precisely because of who Anne was. She was known for discipline, endurance, and commitment. If someone with her reputation resisted the expectation, then others might feel justified doing the same. Anne warned that forcing gestures of personal submission would not create unity. It could create the opposite. People might obey publicly while resentment deepened privately, waiting for a worse moment to surface. Then the conversation became personal. Charles suggested that repeated resistance toward Camilla was no longer only about Camilla. At some point, he argued, it became resistance toward the choices he had made as both king and husband. Anne rejected that completely. She could support Charles without endorsing every expectation surrounding his wife. She could defend the monarchy while questioning how far palace protocol should reach into family life. Neither sibling truly yielded, but the disagreement had now moved beyond a doorway and into the future shape of the monarchy itself. But Charles was not the only person disturbed by Anne's argument, because once the disagreement reached the wider family, William realized the dispute could eventually become his problem as well. William had remained almost invisible during the confrontation, but he understood its implications immediately. This was not merely Charles managing two powerful women. It was a preview of a question William himself would someday inherit. How much of royal authority depends on rules, and how much depends on people willingly accepting them? For William, the danger was not the argument itself. Families argue. Royal families simply have the added burden of turning those disagreements into symbols. What concerned him was how easily one unresolved question could survive from one reign into the next, growing heavier each time nobody defined the boundary clearly enough. He could understand Charles's frustration. A monarchy built on ceremony could not function if every entrance, procession, or seating arrangement became open to private interpretation. At some point, order had to mean something. Rank had to carry weight. Otherwise, even the smallest gesture could become a negotiation. But Anne's warning was difficult to dismiss. William knew that authority pushed too far could become resentment. A family member might obey in public and still feel diminished in private. That kind of obedience could look peaceful for years, until one moment exposed everything beneath it. And Catherine made the question even more personal. William understood that she too would one day stand in a position of immense authority. Her role would need to be respected. Yet he did not want that respect to depend on making every relative feel constantly subordinate. To him, the future court had to be disciplined without becoming cold, structured without becoming brittle. So William quietly encouraged Charles to draw a clearer line. State occasions were one thing. Formal precedents had to be protected there. Private family gatherings were different. The rules could not carry the same emotional force into every room. Charles hesitated. Written guidance, he feared, could make the dispute look more serious than it was. William saw the opposite. The ambiguity was already serious. When expectations remained unspoken, every doorway became a test. Every chair became a signal. Every procession, greeting, and pause risked being interpreted as loyalty or defiance. That was the real consequence of Anne's refusal. She had forced William to imagine his own reign before he was ready to. Not simply the ceremonies, but the invisible rules beneath them. And the question stayed with him. What kind of court could survive if people followed its customs without believing in them? Yet while William focused on preventing the next crisis, Camilla was confronting something far more personal, the unsettling realization that a crown could secure precedence without guaranteeing belonging. For Camilla, the deepest wound was not that Anne had refused to move. It was what the refusal seemed to suggest. After years of transformation, acceptance, and carefully managed appearances, one quiet standoff had reopened the question she could never completely escape: had the institution accepted her faster than the family? That question carried a different kind of pain, because Camilla's position was no longer uncertain in any formal sense. The title was clear. The precedence was clear. The public role was clear. Yet Anne's refusal seemed to expose a private divide that ceremony could not repair. To Camilla, it suggested that some relatives could acknowledge the Queen without ever fully accepting the woman behind the title. Her journey had depended on patience. She had learned when to remain quiet, when to absorb criticism, and when not to force acceptance before others were ready to give it. That restraint had helped her survive some of the monarchy's most difficult emotional territory. But the doorway incident showed how quickly years of careful progress could suddenly feel fragile. Camilla began questioning her own response. Had remaining still protected her dignity? Or had her silence allowed Anne's position to appear stronger? The uncertainty mattered, because doing more in that moment might have looked aggressive, while doing less risked making her authority seem optional. Charles tried to reassure her. Her ceremonial and constitutional standing, he insisted, was not under threat. But Camilla knew that was not the real issue. The problem was not what the palace rulebook said. The problem was what certain members of the family appeared willing to feel. Even so, she did not want Charles humiliating Anne on her behalf. That kind of victory could create a deeper wound and turn future gatherings into even colder encounters. Camilla understood that forcing submission could cost more than it gained, but she was equally clear about something else. This could not happen again. Another unresolved confrontation would no longer look accidental. It would establish a pattern. So rather than seeking a personal victory over Anne, Camilla began pushing for something more controlled. Clearer rules, fewer assumptions, and less room for individual interpretation. That solution, however, placed Charles in an even more difficult position. Formalizing precedents could protect Camilla while appearing to confirm Anne's fear that royal hierarchy was reaching too deeply into private family life. The palace now faced a choice between two dangerous solutions, leave the rules vague, and risk another rebellion, or define them so clearly that everyone would know exactly who had won. No dramatic announcement followed the standoff. There was no public reprimand and no visible punishment. Instead, the palace responded in the way royal institutions often handle their most uncomfortable disputes, quietly, administratively, and with enough precision to ensure the same confrontation could never happen quite the same way again. The first change was subtle but important. Senior aides began drawing a firmer line between formal ceremonial precedence and ordinary family movement. At state occasions, there would be less uncertainty. Entrance orders, procession positions, and seating arrangements would be settled earlier, communicated more clearly, and left with as little room for personal interpretation as possible. That mattered, because the doorway confrontation had exposed exactly what happened when expectations were allowed to remain unspoken. A few seconds of hesitation had nearly turned family tension into a public statement. Under the new understanding, Camilla's official position would be protected where rank clearly mattered. She would not be left waiting for another relative to decide whether to step aside. At the same time, Anne would not be expected to perform unnecessary gestures of personal deference in moments that were private rather than ceremonial. For Anne, that distinction was crucial. She could accept hierarchy when it served the crown. What she resisted was the idea that hierarchy should enter every personal interaction and demand emotional submission. The revised arrangement gave her a boundary she could live with. Camilla also accepted it, but for a different reason. She no longer had to depend on goodwill at the final second. The rules would speak before anyone had the chance to test them. Charles understood the compromise had solved the practical problem, but he also knew what it had not solved. The resentment beneath the confrontation had not disappeared. It had simply been contained. William saw something more lasting in the arrangement. To him, it offered a possible blueprint for the future: fewer assumptions, clearer boundaries, and less room for private disagreements to hide inside royal ceremony. Yet the irony was difficult to escape. The palace had restored order only by admitting, without ever saying so publicly, that the relationships beneath that order were fragile enough to require protection. The rules were clearer. The feelings were not. And that might have been where the story ended, had Charles not made one final decision at the next gathering, a decision that revealed exactly what the king had learned from the silence at that doorway. At the next palace gathering, everyone knew where to look. Anne arrived. Camilla arrived. Charles understood that one misplaced step could revive the entire controversy. But instead of forcing either woman to yield, he changed the arrangement himself, and the message behind that decision was impossible to miss. This time, Charles left nothing to chance. At the formal point where precedence mattered, he and Camilla would enter together. There would be no pause, no uncertain space, and no moment in which Anne could appear to be either yielding or resisting. Camilla's position beside the king would be unmistakable, but the solution carried another message just as carefully. Anne would not be placed in a position where she had to visibly step aside. Her place was arranged separately, with the dignity appropriate to her own role. It was a small adjustment, but emotionally, it changed everything. Charles had found a way to defend Camilla's status without turning his sister into an example of what happened when someone challenged the order around the queen. Anne accepted the arrangement without apology. She did not need a public victory. What mattered to her was the distinction she had fought to preserve. Respect for the institution did not have to mean personal submission in every private interaction. Camilla also resisted the temptation to treat the outcome as a triumph. She understood that forcing Anne into an obvious defeat would only create deeper resistance. A humiliated relative might obey once, but resentment could last far longer than ceremony. William watched closely. For him, the lesson was larger than either woman. Authority, he realized, was not strongest when it was constantly displayed. Sometimes the monarchy protected itself by knowing when to insist and when to leave space. Rules mattered, but so did the willingness of people to live under them without feeling crushed by them. Charles had learned something too. Silence had exposed a weakness he could no longer ignore. From now on, ambiguity would be confronted earlier, before small uncertainties hardened into open defiance. And yet the final truth remained uncomfortable. Nobody had truly won. Camilla kept her precedence. Anne kept her independence. Charles protected both relationships. But the palace had lost something of its old illusion. Titles could settle rank. They could determine order. They could command respect. What they could not do was erase memory, force affection, or guarantee that the people standing closest to the crown would ever see its rules in exactly the same way.